The air at 27,000 feet does not just feel cold, it feels hostile, a thin, lethal ether that wants to kill you almost as much as the Germans do. It was April 8th, 1943, and I was shivering inside the cockpit of a machine that felt less like an aeroplane and more like a celestial locomotive. Through the plexiglass, the sky over Caen, France, was a terrifyingly brilliant shade of blue, a crystal bowl where we were the fish, and the sharks were already circling. I looked over my shoulder, scanning the formation. We were 16 massive silhouettes laboring upward, our engines screaming against the thin air. We looked ungainly, we looked heavy. To the Luftwaffe pilots waiting above us, sleek in their Focke Wulf 190s, we must have looked like a joke. I couldn't hear him, of course, but I could feel the disdain radiating from the enemy leader, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermiken. We later learned he was up there, peering down through the canopy of his nimble fighter, likely wearing a smirk that his oxygen mask couldn't quite hide. He keyed his radio, broadcasting a sentiment that would haunt us for months. The armies have sent us flying milk bottles. He was laughing at us. And looking at my own wings, struggling for purchase in the stratosphere, I could almost understand why. We were flying the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and we were making our combat debut over occupied Europe. To the German veterans who had cut their teeth on Spitfires and Soviet Yaks, our ships were grotesque. We were corpulent, barrel-shaped beasts topping 7 tons fully loaded. We had greenhouse canopies that sat high atop fuselages that seemed too thick, wings that appeared too small, and propellers that were so large they looked like they belonged on a bomber. The Germans called them milk bottles or bathtubs. We called them the jug. And on that freezing April morning, we were the underdogs and the heaviest single-engine fighters ever built. What Hermiken and his wolves didn't know, what none of us fully understood yet, was that the math had changed. They saw fat targets. We were actually riding the arrival of industrial inevitability. We were the weapon that would systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe, not with grace, but with brute force. We were carrying the mathematics of destruction in our wings, 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, feeding 8 Browning machine guns that harmonized into a buzzsaw capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. We could saw a Messerschmitt in half in under 2 seconds. But on that day, we were just novices in untried machines, waiting for the slaughter. The fear in my gut wasn't just about the enemy, it was about the airplane itself. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th, was leading us. He was an Eagle Squadron veteran, a man who had flown the elegant, dancing Spitfire. He knew what we were up against. He knew that to survive in this monster, we had to unlearn everything we thought we knew about dogfighting. The Thunderbolt was a radical departure from the philosophy of flight. The Germans built interceptors that climbed like rockets and turned on a dime. Republic Aviation, conversely, had built a high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, power, and kinetic energy to rewrite the laws of physics. We were 56 Americans spread across that French sky, men who would eventually become legends. But right then we were green. We had been in combat for exactly 0 days. The Germans had been fighting since 1939. This wasn't just a battle of men. It was a collision of philosophies. It was the story of how American industrial logic, quantity, and durability would crush tactical brilliance. I remembered the first time I saw the jug back in the States. It was born from panic. In June 1940, as the Nazis swept through France, Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born genius at Republic, realized the Army Air Corps needed a miracle. He designed a dinosaur. He admitted it to his team. It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. When the prototype flew in May 1941, it shocked everyone. It was 65% heavier than its predecessor. It looked pregnant, swollen with a massive turbo supercharger system that ran through the belly of the plane like guts in a beast. When I first walked up to it on the tarmac, I asked the same question every pilot asked. Does this thing actually fly? It did fly. It flew like a demon at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine was an 18-cylinder radial that churned out 2,000 horsepower. It was a factory of noise and power. At 27,000 feet, where the German engines were gasping for oxygen, the Jug's turbo supercharger force-fed the engine, giving us sea-level performance in the stratosphere. But learning to tame it was a bloody business. My mind flashed back to our training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, under Major Hub Zemke. We despised the aircraft at first. Between September 1942 and January 1943, we lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft just trying to learn how to fly the damn things. The P-47 killed more of us in training than the Germans would in our first months of combat. It ground looped if you looked at the rudder wrong. It torque rolled on takeoff if you punched the throttle too hard. And if you dove it, it fell so fast that we discovered the terrifying phenomenon of compressibility. Shock waves forming on the wings, freezing the controls solid, turning the stick into a useless piece of metal while the ground rushed up to meet you. But those of us who survived the training found something intoxicating. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, put it best after his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly the Jug, you aimed it. However, aiming it at a nimble focke wulf was a different story. In those first encounters in April and May, the Germans confirmed every prejudice they held. We couldn't turn with them. We couldn't climb with them. At medium altitudes, we were sluggish. The Luftwaffe pilots, quick to adapt, attacked us from below, exploiting our weight, forcing us into turning fights where our mass worked against us. Their commanders reported back that the American fighter was meat for the slaughter. They mocked us. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. They called us Indiana, fat targets pretending to be warriors. The statistics were grim. In our first month, we lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF pilots, looking down their noses from their Spitfires, quietly suggested we should switch planes. They joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap your harness and run around the cockpit because it was so roomy. But amidst the losses, something strange was happening, something the German intelligence officers missed. We weren't dying as easily as we should have. We were coming home with holes in us that would have disintegrated a Spitfire or a Zero. On May 4th, one of my squad mates returned with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. His plane looked like Swiss cheese, but the engine, that massive air-cooled radial, kept humming. We didn't have vulnerable coolant radiators to puncture. We were flying tanks. And when we did get our nose to the enemy, the result was catastrophic. We didn't have the limited ammo of the cannon-armed fighters. We had 30 seconds of continuous fire. When 8 50 calibers converged on a target, they didn't just poke holes, they vaporized metal. We were creating a convergence zone of absolute destruction. The turning point, the moment the laughter stopped, happened on June 26, 1943, over Forges-les-Eaux. It involved Bob Johnson, the Oklahoma boy. I wasn't on his wing that day, but the story spread through the barracks like wildfire, changing the way every single one of us looked at our machines. Johnson was flying rear guard in a formation of 48 jugs when 16 Focke Wulfs from JG-26 bounced them. They came out of the sun, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Gallen. It was a perfect ambush. Johnson was caught in a crossfire that should have killed him 3 times over. In the span of seconds, 21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. Imagine the sound, the deafening, tearing impact of explosive shells ripping through aluminium. His canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit, blinding him. The engine cowling was torn away. Fire erupted behind his instrument panel. Shrapnel tore into his nose and leg. He was bleeding, burning, and falling. He tried to bail out, clawing at the canopy release, but it wouldn't budge. A shell had exploded in the track, welding the metal shut. He was trapped in a dying coffin at 27,000 feet. But the coffin didn't die. Johnson kicked the rudder, wiped the oil from his windscreen, and realized the engine was still running, shaking violently, spitting oil, missing half its cylinders. The double Wasp kept turning. He leveled out and pointed the nose toward England. Any other fighter in the world would have been falling debris by now. The Jug was limping home. Then it got worse. A lone German ace spotted him. We never identified the pilot, but he must have thought it was his lucky day. A crippled American sitting duck plodding along at 170 miles per hour. The German slid in behind Johnson. This is the moment that defines the P-47. Johnson couldn't evade. He couldn't fight back. He could only hunch his shoulders behind the heavy armor plate behind his seat and pray. The German opened fire. Boom, 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 boom. 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns unloaded into the fuselage. Johnson felt the impacts like sledgehammers against his back. The plane shuddered, absorbing the kinetic energy of the shells. The rudder was shredded, the wings were perforated, but the armor plate held, the structural spars held. The German, likely confused why the American hadn't exploded, repositioned. He had exhausted his cannon shells. He closed into point-blank range and held down the trigger on his machine guns, raking the Thunderbolt from wingtip to wingtip. Johnson sat there, huddled in the wreckage of his cockpit, listening to the bullets chewing through the metal skin of his aircraft, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. The German pilot pulled up alongside him. He looked at the shattered wreck of the P-47 flying on pure stubbornness and industrial might. He looked at Johnson, bloodied but alive inside. The German shook his head in disbelief, rocked his wings in a gesture of bewildered respect, and peeled away. He had simply run out of ammunition. Johnson landed that plane. He had counted the bullet holes later. There were hundreds, but he walked away. That was the day we knew. The laughter in the German mess halls died that summer. They realized that their tactical brilliance, their elegant flying, and their years of experience meant nothing if they couldn't shoot us down. We were bringing a new kind of war to Europe. It wasn't about the art of the dogfight anymore. It was about volume. It was about horsepower. It was about sitting in a 7-ton bathtub that could fly through a brick wall and keep going. Looking back at that April morning, watching the smirking Germans circling above, I wish I could have told them what was coming. I wish I could have told them that the flying milk bottles were filled with nitroglycerin. I wish I could have told them that the fat, clumsy American planes struggling for altitude were about to break the back of the Luftwaffe. We weren't nimble, and we weren't pretty, but by God, we were unstoppable. The age of the interceptor was ending, the age of the juggernaut had begun, and the only thing colder than the air at 27,000 feet was the realization dawning in the hearts of the enemy. The Americans were here, and we were flying machines that simply refused to die. That realization didn't happen overnight. It started with the miracle of Robert Johnson. If you want to understand why we stopped fearing the Focke wolves and started hunting them, you have to picture Johnson's P-47 limping back to Manston that spring. It wasn't just a damaged plane, it was a flying sieve. I remember standing on the tarmac, the smell of burnt oil and scorched aluminium hanging heavy in the damp English air, watching the crew chief run his hands over the fuselage. He stopped counting bullet holes when he hit 200. The story Johnson told us in the debriefing room sounded like a tall tale, the kind you spin after 3 beers at the officers' club, but the wreckage outside didn't lie. He had been caught slow and low by a German ace. Jerry had emptied his cannons into him. When the cannons ran dry, he switched to machine guns. Johnson told us he could feel the impacts like sledgehammers against the airframe. A 20-millimeter shell had exploded inches from his head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat, a piece of steel that saved his spine from being turned into jelly. The engine took hits. The control cables were hanging by threads. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural spine of the aircraft, were severed. By all laws of aerodynamics, the tail should have snapped off. But the most chilling part wasn't the damage. It was the German pilot's reaction. Johnson saw him pull alongside, wingtip to wingtip. He described a young blonde kid, probably brimming with the arrogance of the Luftwaffe, staring into Johnson's cockpit. The look went from confidence to confusion, and then to something primal, fear. The German shook his head, unable to comprehend why this burning American wreck was still flying. He gave a little salute and peeled away. He didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because he had nothing left to shoot. That aircraft brought Johnson home. When the engineers tore it apart, they realized they had underestimated their own creation. We weren't flying fighters, we were flying tanks with wings. By July 1943, that durability gave us the confidence to change the game. We stopped trying to dance with the Luftwaffe. You don't try to waltz with a bear, you maul it. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, the old man of the 56th, pounded this into our skulls until we dreamed about it. Don't turn with them, he'd bark, his face red with frustration. Don't climb with them on the deck. Use your weight, use your power, use your guns. We learned to turn our greatest weakness, that massive 7-ton girth, into a weapon of kinetic energy. We called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot, but the brass called it energy management. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin and cold, biting through your flight jacket, frosting the canopy. Up there, the P-47 was a king. We could hit 550 miles per hour in a dive. That's faster than anything the Germans had. Even their Focke-Wulf 190s, which could roll like demons, couldn't touch us in a vertical plunge. We would spot them below, looking like dark specks against the green quilt of Europe, and we would roll inverted. Gravity took over. The engine roared, the airframe shuddered, and the airspeed indicator wound up tight. It was a boom and zoom tactic, brutal and simple. We would drop on them like anvils from the stratosphere. They couldn't deflect or shoot us because we were moving too fast for their sights to track. We would scream down, fire a burst, and use that massive momentum to zoom climb back up into the safety of the thin air, leaving them stalled and helpless below. And when we fired, God help them. The true revelation of what we could do came during the dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August. It was the deepest we'd ever pushed into the Reich. I remember Major Dave Schilling leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron. We were at 28,000 feet, engines humming, scanning the horizon. Below us, a formation of Messerschmitt 110s appeared. They were destroyer aircraft, twin-engine killers, armed with heavy cannons and rockets, positioning themselves to massacre our B-17s. They thought they were the hunters. Schilling tipped his wing and led the flight down. We came down like hammers from heaven. I remember the radio chatter, the tense breathing, the G-forces pulling the blood from my head as we leveled out behind them. A German gunner in one of those 110s later said he saw us and opened fire at 800 meters. He saw his round spark off Schilling's wing, but the jug didn't even wobble, it just kept coming. Then the American guns spoke. You have to understand the violence of 8 50 caliber machine guns firing at once. We carried Ford 25 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total. That's nearly 900 pounds of lead and chemistry. At the convergence point, usually set to 300 yards, those 8 streams of fire intersected into a buzzsaw about 6 feet wide. We were throwing 100 half-inch projectiles every single second. Each bullet was traveling at 2,900 feet per second. We mixed armor-piercing incendiary with tracers. When Schilling opened up, the aircraft ahead of him didn't just fall, it evaporated. It wasn't a kill, it was an erasure. I saw wings shear off the fuselage. I saw tails sever. The crew compartments, where those poor German boys were sitting, turned into confetti of aluminium and glass. In less than 60 seconds, 8 Messerschmitts were wiped from the sky. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. We had another advantage, one the Germans didn't understand until it was too late: ammunition capacity. Their 109s and 190s carried maybe 12 seconds of cannon fire. They had to be stingy. We could hold the trigger down for 30 seconds. It felt like an eternity in combat time. We could spray, correct, and spray again. Gabreski, who had a nose for killing that scared even us sometimes, put it best. He said, "When you hit them with all 8, they don't go down, they explode." He was right. I once saw a 109 cut literally in half, the tail spinning one way, the engine and cockpit tumbling another. The pilot was dead before he knew he was under attack. By September, the Luftwaffe faced a new horror. We started taking the fight higher. The Germans relied on mechanical superchargers. They were good low down, but above 25,000 feet, their engines started to gasp. They were choking. We, on the other hand, had that massive turbo supercharger in the belly of the jug, force-feeding oxygen to the double Wasp engine. We kept our power all the way to the roof of the world. I remember reading the report about Hans Philipp. He was a legend to them, a superman with over 200 kills. He had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. But on October 8th, over Bremen, he met the Thunderbolt at 32,000 feet. He was flying a Focke Wulf 190, usually a terrifying machine. But up there in the thin air, it was sluggish. It wallowed. He couldn't turn. He couldn't climb. He was sitting in a coffin. When our boys from the 56th dove on him, he was a sitting duck. Robert Johnson, the same Johnson whose plane had been riddled months earlier, caught him. The combat report was clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, observed strikes along the entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. Philip never opened his chute. That shook them. If a man with 500 combat missions couldn't survive the Thunderbolt at altitude, what chance did the fresh recruits have? We were taking the high ground, literally and figuratively. Then came January 1944, and the engineers gave us the final piece of the puzzle. We called them paddle blades. It was a new propeller, a Hamilton Standard behemoth, 13 feet across, with wide, flat cords that looked like canoe paddles. They replaced the old toothpick props. The difference was instant. Before, we climbed like a brick, maybe 2,200 feet per minute if you were lucky. With the paddles biting into the air, we shot up at 3,000 feet per minute. We could match the Germans in the climb now. We could accelerate in level flight like a drag racer. I remember the first time a flight of 109s tried to play their usual game near Hanover. They bounced us, took a shot, and then pulled up hard, expecting us to stall out beneath them. They looked back and saw 4 tons of aluminium right on their tails, climbing with them. You could almost sense the panic over the radio frequencies. Heinz Knocker, one of their experienced leaders, wrote in his diary that the fat American fighters had learned to climb. He watched his wingman get blown apart because he couldn't outrun the Jug anymore. The predator had become the prey. The paddle blades changed the sound of the war, too. The tips of that massive prop were moving so fast, they broke the sound barrier. It created this deep, thundering roar, a continuous sonic boom that you could feel in your chest from miles away. The German infantry hated it. They called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. They said they could tell it was us just by the vibration in the ground. It sounded like Judgment Day was approaching. By March, we were carrying drop tanks, big 108-gallon kegs of fuel under the wings or belly. We weren't just patrolling the coast anymore. We were going downtown. We could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. We would haul those tanks for hundreds of miles, sipping fuel, waiting. When the Luftwaffe rose to meet the bombers, we would drop the tanks, arm the guns, and suddenly we were fighting fresh and fully loaded deep in their backyard. The German pilots developed a grudging respect that bordered on neurosis. They knew they had to get past us to hit the bombers, but flying through a screen of P-47s was suicide. We were faster in the dive. We owned the high altitude. We could outturn them at high speeds thanks to our hydraulic controls. And if we hit them, they died. If they hit us, we just absorbed it. I recall one mission late in the spring of '44. We were escorting a box of B-17s, the contrails streaking white across the blue. A gaggle of focke wolves appeared at our 12 o'clock, leveling off for a head-on pass. Usually, in a head-on pass, the smarter pilot breaks away first. It's a game of chicken played at a closing speed of 800 miles an hour. I lined up on the lead German. I could see the flashes of his cannons winking at me. I checked my sight, gripped the stick, and held my course. I knew my radial engine was a wall of steel in front of me. I knew my armor plate would catch what the engine missed. I knew I had 8 guns against his 4. I didn't flinch, I didn't break. He did. At the last second, the German pilot yanked his stick back, exposing his belly. It was a fatal mistake. I hammered the trigger. The aircraft shuddered as the battery of 50s unleashed that wall of lead. I saw the strikes walk up his fuselage, from the engine cowling to the cockpit. The canopy shattered, smoke erupted, black and oily. He rolled over and went down, spinning into the cloud deck below. I didn't watch him fall. I checked my 6, pulled back on the stick, and felt the paddle blades bite into the thin air, pulling me back up to the perch. My heart was hammering against my ribs, matching the rhythm of the engine. The cockpit smelled of sweat and cordite, the perfume of survival. We weren't the graceful knights of the air the British claimed to be. We were brawlers. We were heavyweights in a ring of lightweights. We had taken a machine that everyone said was too big, too heavy, and too clumsy, and we had turned it into the most terrifying weapon in the sky. Looking down at the burning wreckage of that Focke-Wulf, a dark smear against the pristine German countryside, I finally understood what Johnson had felt that day on the runway at Manston. The Germans started this war thinking technology and blitzkrieg would make them invincible. But they forgot that war isn't just about speed, it's about endurance. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep coming. We were the Thunderbolt men, we were the juggernaut, and as I banked my silver monster back toward the bomber stream, hunting for the next target, I knew the Luftwaffe was finished. They could still fly, and they could still fight, but they could not stop the thunder. We were simply too heavy, too fast, and too mean to die. The sky belonged to us now. That dominance didn't happen overnight, and God knows it didn't come without a learning curve. We heard the stories from the other side, eventually the interrogation reports that floated around the mess halls like ghost stories. There was this German major, Gunther Rahl, a man with nearly 300 kills to his name, a true predator of the Eastern Front. He'd looked up at us in March of '44, squinting into the sun, seeing those thick, heavy fuselages outlined against the glare. He told his men, "Here come the flying pigs," and someone on the radio had laughed. I wish I could have seen their faces 30 seconds later. The laughter died the second we tipped our noses over. We didn't glide. We fell like an avalanche, a 7-ton brick dropping out of the heavens faster than their reflexes could track. When we opened up, it wasn't the polite burp burp of their cannons. It was a solid, continuous stream of lead, a fire hose of destruction that didn't just damage their messerschmitts, it erased them. Rahl lost 3 fighters in that first pass, just transformed instantly into burning debris and memories. That was the lesson they learned the hard way. You don't laugh at the jug, you run or you burn. But the air-to-air scraps were only half the story. By the spring of '44, the Mustangs, those pretty P-51s with their Rolls-Royce engines, were taking over the long-range escort job. That left us, the heavyweights, to get down in the mud. We became the Jabos, the fighter bombers, and that's where the war truly changed for the poor bastards on the ground. We stopped being just fighters and became the most feared weapon in the Allied arsenal. I remember when the transition started in earnest that April. We were prepping for the invasion, and the brass decided to strap ordnance to us that would break the back of a medium bomber. The D-25 variant was a beast. We hung 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the belly. Suddenly, I wasn't just a pilot. I was flying a single-seat B-25 Mitchell with an attitude problem. And then came the rockets. 10 high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, hanging off zero-length stubs, each one hit with the force of a 105mm artillery shell. We unleashed hell on the French countryside. I recall reading about Oberst Hans von Luck, a panzer commander who faced us in Normandy. He said we came in so low he could see our faces, see the goggles and the oxygen masks. The sound, he said, was the worst part. First, the roar of that double Wasp engine, then the banshee scream of the rockets, and finally the hammer, the relentless, rhythmic thudding of 8 heavy machine guns. We caught a column of his trucks on a narrow road. In one pass, 20 vehicles simply ceased to exist. They were there 1 second, and the next, they were just burning skeletons and black smoke. It wasn't combat. It was an execution. We were flying artillery with sniper precision, and the psychological effect on the Wehrmacht was devastating. Come June 6, D-Day, we showed the Luftwaffe exactly how much the scales had tipped. Over 500 of us formed an impenetrable umbrella over those beaches. We were stacked from the wave tops up to 30,000 feet, a wall of aluminium and anger. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer tried to break through that morning with 12 fighters. He was the only one who went home. He said later that the sky belonged to the Americans, that you couldn't climb over us, and you couldn't dive under us. When they tried, our guns turned their sleek fighters into what he called aluminium rain, In the weeks after the landings, we systematically dismantled their ability to wage war. We hunted everything that moved. In June alone, the 9th Air Force claimed over 600 locomotives and nearly 4,000 trucks. We forced the entire German army to become creatures of the night, hiding in the forests during the day because if they moved, we killed them. They tried everything to stop us. More armor, more flak, better camouflage, but nothing worked. The 88mm guns, terrified of us, couldn't track us fast enough on the deck. We were unstoppable. But it wasn't just Europe. On the other side of the world, in the sweating jungles of the Pacific, the Jug was proving she could fight anywhere. The 348th Fighter Group, operating out of New Guinea, found that the Thunderbolt was perfect for those vast, unforgiving distances. Colonel Neil Kirby, a man with ice water in his veins, rewrote the book on Pacific tactics. I heard about his mission over Wewak in October of '43. He took 4 Jugs against 40 Japanese fighters. 40. He shot down 6 of them himself. The Japanese pilots, used to fighting the flimsy, nimble Wildcats, didn't know how to handle a plane that refused to die. Their ace, Saburo Sakai, called us monsters. He wrote about pumping 20mm cannon shells into a Thunderbolt, shots that would have vaporized a P-40, and watching the American plane just fly away, absorbing the punishment like a boxer taking a jab. And when we returned fire, our heavy bullets tore their paper-thin zeros into confetti. Then came the N model, the long-legged girl with wet wings holding 93 gallons of gas per side. She could fly over 2,000 miles, escorting the B-29s all the way to Tokyo. The short-legged fighter of 43 had evolved into a marathon runner. Back in Europe, the technology war was shifting again. We started seeing them late in '44, the jets, the Me-262s. They looked like sharks, no propellers, moving at speeds that didn't make sense, topping 540 miles per hour. By all rights, they should have been untouchable. But we learned fast. We caught them where they were weak, taking off, landing, or when we had the altitude advantage. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer showed us how it was done that November. He spotted a jet while diving from 28,000 feet. In a dive, a Thunderbolt is a falling safe. Gravity is your best friend. Meyer hit nearly 500 mph, catching the jet pilot who thought he was safe in level flight. He opened up at 400 yards. The report said the enemy aircraft disintegrated, engines ripped off, fuselage shattered. It turned out that 850 calibers hitting a jet structure at high velocity did a lot more damage than the engineers anticipated. By '45, we had our own hot rods, the P-47M. We injected water and methanol into the cylinders, boosting the engine to 2,800 horsepower. We could hit 470 motors on the level. Major George Bostwick bagged 2 jets in March just by using his head. He knew the jets couldn't turn and couldn't take a hit. They come apart like they're made of paper, he said. We forced them to slow down to fight, and that's when we ate them alive. The final testament to what we had built, what America had built, came on New Year's Day, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte. It was the Luftwaffe's dying gasp, a surprise attack on our airfields across the Low Countries. At Metz, they caught the 365th on the ground. It was bad. 22 of our Jugs are burning on the tarmac, smoke choking the cold winter air. A captured German pilot, arrogant even in defeat, pointed at the wreckage and asked Major George Brooking what he thought of their work. Brooking didn't blink. He pointed to the flight line where the crews were already shoving the burning hulks aside with bulldozers, clearing the hard stands. By tomorrow, Brooking told him, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The smirk vanished from that German's face because he knew the truth. We lost 134 planes that day. They were all replaced within a week. The Germans lost over 200 pilots, men they could never get back. That was the difference. It wasn't just about the pilots. It was about the machine behind us. Republic Aviation built nearly 16,000 Thunderbolts. At the peak, the factory in Farmingdale was spitting out one fully combat-ready fighter every single hour, 24 hours a day. Think about that. In Indiana, they built a factory on empty farmland and were pushing out 500 planes a month by 44. Each bird had 65,000 parts, 8 miles of wire, and an engine machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. And who built them? Women who had never held a wrench before Pearl Harbor, assembling the most complex killing machines in history with a precision that shamed peacetime standards. We were firing 10 million rounds of ammunition a month, 10 million. We were drowning the Axis in logistics, burying them under a mountain of aluminum, rubber, and steel. The P-47 wasn't just an airplane. It was the physical embodiment of a nation's resolve. It was heavy, it was tough, and it was absolutely relentless. So when I looked down at that burning focke wulf, seeing the black smoke stain the snow, I didn't just feel victory. I felt the weight of everything that got us there, the sweat of the girls in Evansville, the genius of the engineers who designed the turbo supercharger, the cold, terrifying dives of the men who figured out how to tame the beast. We had taken a 7-ton milk jug and turned it into the angel of death. The war was effectively over, even if the shooting hadn't stopped. We had better planes, we had more gas, and we had an endless supply of ammunition. But mostly, we had the jug. And as I throttled up, feeling that massive Pratt & Whitney radial shake the airframe around me, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what they threw at us, jets, rockets, or desperate last stands, we were going to smash it. We were the Thunderbolt men, and we were hammering the final nails into the coffin of the Third Reich, one solid stream of fire at a time. The sky didn't just belong to us. We had conquered it, paved it with steel, and dared anyone to challenge the claim. They never did. But that dominance wasn't an accident. And it certainly wasn't magic. It was the result of a logistical tidal wave that started thousands of miles away, deep in the American heartland. While we were up there turning the sky into a graveyard for the Luftwaffe, the folks back home were working miracles to keep our magazines full. I remember hearing about the Lake City Arsenal out in Missouri. That one plant alone was churning out 30 million rounds of ammunition every single month. Just think about that number, 30 million. Each one of those cartridges was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. They had to be. When you're pulling negative Gs and diving at 400 miles an hour, you can't have a jam. You need reliable feeding through those synchronized gun mechanisms, or you're a dead man. We never really thought about the factory workers while we were strafing rail yards, but their fingerprints were on every trigger pull. It wasn't just the lead either, it was the juice. The Thunderbolt was a thirsty beast. In normal flight, we burned through 100 gallons an hour. But when the fight was on, and we kicked in the water injection to get that extra war emergency power, we were guzzling up to 300 gallons an hour. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was consuming over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel a month. That is an ocean of high-octane gasoline, all of it shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of the same mass production genius. We were drowning the Germans in resources. That disparity in resources extended to the men in the cockpit, too. Even more impressive than the aircraft production was the pilot training. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually from advanced training. That was more than Germany had trained in the entire war. I looked around the briefing room and saw men who knew their machines inside and out. Each P-47 pilot received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before they ever saw combat, including a solid 100 hours in advanced fighters. We arrived in Europe knowing how to fly in formation, how to navigate by instruments, and exactly how to lead a deflection shot. We had practiced against captured German aircraft back in the States. We knew what a customized Focke Wulf could do, and more importantly, what it couldn't do. Contrast that with the poor bastards we were shooting down. By the end of the war, German pilots were being thrown into the grinder with less than 100 hours of total flight time. It showed. I remember when Lieutenant Eugene Roberts arrived in our squadron in September 1944. The kid had 420 hours in his logbook, including 75 specifically in the jug. He had fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting until his neck was stiff, and studied gun camera film from actual combat until his eyes watered. On his very first mission, he knew exactly what to do. He told me later that the German pilot he faced couldn't have had half his experience. He said it didn't even feel like a fair fight. It wasn't. It was a professional executing an amateur. The Germans knew it too. I recall reading a captured intelligence report after the surrender featuring an interview with Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller. He was the same ace who had mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier. By March 1945, the arrogance was gone. He told the propaganda officials, who were desperate for something, anything to boost morale, that the Thunderbolt was the best fighter-bomber ever built. His statement was deemed too demoralizing for publication, so they buried it, but we found it. Priller had said our firepower was unprecedented, marveling at weapons that never jammed and never overheated. He talked about how we carried bombs like medium bombers and fired rockets like artillery, yet could still fight like a fighter when needed. But what really broke him was what the machine represented: unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20, he said. We lose 1, it's gone forever. He lamented that our pilots arrived better trained than their instructors, with fuel for training and ammunition for practice. We have nothing but courage, he told them. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. He admitted they had laughed at us in 1943, but they weren't laughing anymore. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages had grounded most of their aircraft, and the experienced pilots were either dead or rotting in POW camps. Their airfields were cratered ruins, but even when they could scrape together a few planes and enough gas to fly them, German pilots faced an impossible equation. Attacking meant facing P-47 formations that owned every altitude from the grass to 40,000 feet. I remember hearing about Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945. He flew exactly 1 combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds. He described seeing 4 Thunderbolts diving from above in perfect formation. He tried to turn, but we were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. Brettschneider said his aircraft shook like it was being hit by sledgehammers. His engine exploded, his wings separated, and he barely managed to bail out. Hanging in his parachute, he watched us destroy his entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. He said the sky rained burning aluminium and bodies. That was the reality of the air war in the final days. The psychological impact was absolute. The German pilots developed what their medical officers called jabo fever. It was a physical sickness, symptoms of intense stress that appeared whenever Thunderbolts were reported in the area. We had veterans on the other side who had faced Spitfires and hurricanes without flinching, yet they became physically ill before missions against us. The distinctive thunder of our approaching engines caused panic among the ground troops, too. They knew that survival meant finding cover immediately. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts them. The final statistics of our operations defy comprehension. In Europe alone, we destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in aerial combat and another 3,315 on the ground. We smashed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored fighting vehicles. We destroyed 68,000 trucks and 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles. The 9th Air Force flew over 213,000 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. Our units achieved a 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber. But behind those numbers lay the human cost. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against the Western Allies. Many fell to the concentrated fire of our heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training that Germany could never replace. By the war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel, we found records that revealed the complete reversal of their opinion. The file on the P-47 had been updated continuously throughout the war. In April 1943, they listed us as a large unmaneuverable fighter, assessing us as a minimal threat. By December of that year, they noted our exceptional high-altitude performance and extreme structural strength. By June 1944, the tone had shifted to panic. They called us the dominant fighter bomber, stating we were a critical threat at all altitudes. By March 1945, their assessment was blunt: unsurvivable in direct engagement. Years later, in 1985, I saw a video from a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, the former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His response captured the complete transformation of their mindset. He admitted they made a terrible mistake in 1943 by laughing at our big, heavy fighter. They thought we had built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand, he said. He realized that the Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. We built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. Galland said the first time he flew a captured P-47 after the war, he understood everything. The power was incredible. He said it climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable, the visibility excellent, the controls precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. But what really impressed him was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced, yet we built them faster than they could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance, he said. He talked about our guns, too. They called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made, a deep, mechanical chord of destruction. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it, Galland said. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The design of the Jug represented our industrial philosophy perfectly. brute force engineering backed by unlimited resources. Every component was overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered. Our wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 Gs. The control cables were doubled throughout with automatic backup systems, and the guns, the ammunition feed system alone was a marvel. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, were fed through electric boost motors to prevent jamming during high-G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each gun had its own charging mechanism and could be individually synchronized. We could adjust the convergence from 150 to 400 yards, optimizing for our preferred engagement range. Even after the war, some stubborn German veterans maintained that we won through quantity, not quality, that their fighters were technically superior, but were simply overwhelmed by numbers. The combat records tell a different story. In engagements where numbers were equal, P-47s consistently prevailed. Our heavy machine gun armament, often dismissed by the Germans as inferior to their cannons, proved more effective in actual combat. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why. Cannon shells, while individually more destructive, required precise aim and had limited ammunition, typically only 120 to 200 rounds total. If you missed with your first burst, you were out of the fight. But the P-47's weapons created a probability cloud of bullets. With 8 guns firing simultaneously, we weren't just shooting at a target. We were filling a cubic acre of sky with lead. It didn't matter if the enemy pilot jinked or rolled. If he was in front of us, he was flying into a solid wall of copper-jacketed death. We buried them under an avalanche of steel. We didn't beat them through better tactics or braver pilots, though I'd argue we had plenty of both. We beat them because we turned war into an industrial process, and the P-47 was the ultimate machine for that assembly line of destruction. It was the anvil upon which the Luftwaffe was broken, and I was proud to be the one swinging the hammer. When I look back at the old photos, at the lines of jugs sitting on the tarmac, gleaming in the sun, I don't just see planes. I see the inevitable force of a nation that decided to win, no matter the cost. We had the fuel, we had the ammo, and by God, we had the plane, and that is why the sky belonged to us. Even with adrenaline shaking my hands and ruining my aim, that cone of fire guaranteed hits. At typical engagement ranges, just holding the trigger for a 2-second burst puts 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, enough to ensure destruction. We knew our ammunition was superior. Our .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds utilized a delayed action fuse that ensured penetration through the enemy's skin before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees, hot enough to ignite aluminium structures. German 20mm shells, while heavier, often exploded on surface contact, causing spectacular flashes, but often only superficial damage. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Her empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. That massive engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war, and my weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet she was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under harsh combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. The transformation of German opinion from mockery to cold terror took less than 2 years. In that time, our flying milk bottle became the most feared aircraft in the Luftwaffe's experience. Veterans who faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of P-47s in hushed tones decades after the war. At the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits proudly among other legendary fighters. The placard lists specifications, but the real story is told by a display case containing spent .50 caliber shells and gun camera film, showing a Focke Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from a German pilot in a 1945 interrogation. He said they laughed when they first saw them, fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. They stopped laughing when they realized we didn't need to turn or climb. We just pointed those big guns, and they simply ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades. The Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. They laughed in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.